The sand has worked its way into every wound. Nefertari is 24 years old, and she can feel the grains grinding against the raw places where the ropes have stripped her wrists, can taste blood and dust on her cracked lips, can smell her own fear mixing with the animal stink of the donkeys that have dragged her cart for 11 days across the desert. She was, until 16 days ago, the wife of Amenhotep, chief scribe of the temple of Amun at Thebes, a woman who wore linen so fine it was nearly transparent, who ate from plates of faience, who had servants to oil her skin and braid her hair with beads of gold. Now she kneels in a wooden cage on wheels, her shaved head burning under the sun of Upper Egypt, her body covered in a shift so rough it raises welts wherever it touches skin. The shift is deliberate. She was told that when she arrived at her destination. Too fine would suggest she retained some status. Too poor would suggest she was not worth the journey. This roughness, this specific grade of discomfort, marked her as what the court had declared her to be. Given. The word had been spoken by the magistrate without emphasis, without cruelty, without any apparent awareness that he was ending her life while leaving her alive. Her husband Amenhotep had been accused of stealing from the temple treasury. The evidence was fabricated. She knew this. The priests knew this. Everyone knew this, but Amenhotep's rival Userhat had powerful friends. And powerful friends meant that evidence did not need to be real to be effective. Amenhotep was sentenced to the copper mines, where men rarely survived more than 2 years. She was sentenced to something else. Something the legal codes described in language so clinical that she had not understood, at first, what it meant. Given to the soldiers of the garrison at Buhan. She had asked the magistrate to clarify. She had asked him to explain what given meant in practical terms, what her status would be, what rights she would retain. The magistrate had looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been nothing at all. "You will have no status," he said. "You will retain no rights. You will be communal property of the garrison. Every soldier, from the commander to the lowest conscript, will have equal claim to your person. You will serve the garrison until you are released, or until you die, whichever comes first." Now, 11 days into the journey that will take her to the southern frontier of Egypt, to a fortress on the edge of Nubian territory where 300 soldiers live in isolation from everything they knew, she is beginning to understand what those words actually meant. The cart stops. Men approach soldiers from the escort, their faces wrapped against the blowing sand, their eyes evaluating her through the gaps in the cloth. They have been evaluating her since the journey began, calculating, assessing, discussing in low voices what will happen when they reach Buhan, and she is officially transferred to garrison command. This is not random cruelty, she is beginning to understand. This is system. This is a punishment that Egypt has refined over centuries, a method of destroying a woman without the mess of execution, a way of making someone disappear from respectable society while technically remaining alive. The garrison at Buhan has received women before. The soldiers know what to do with them. The commanders know how to manage them. There are procedures, protocols, a bureaucracy of degradation that makes the process efficient and the outcomes predictable. One of the soldiers unlocks her cage and drags her out into the burning sand. He pushes a water skin toward her mouth, not from kindness but from practicality. She is cargo. Damaged cargo is less valuable than intact cargo. He is maintaining the merchandise. 3 more days, he says. Then you belong to Buhan. Belong. Another word that carries weight she is only beginning to understand. She drinks the water and memorizes the soldier's face. She memorizes the positions of the guards, the arrangement of the supplies, the direction of the sun, the distance they have traveled. She does not know yet what she will do with this information. But information is the only thing they cannot take from her. and she intends to gather as much of it as possible before she arrives at the place where she will cease to be a person and become something else entirely. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the popular narratives that celebrate ancient Egypt as a civilization of pyramids and pharaohs, of golden treasures and mystical wisdom. The scholars who marvel at Egyptian art and architecture have chosen not to examine too closely what that civilization did to those who fell outside its protections. The documentaries that celebrate Cleopatra and Nefertiti prefer not to mention the women whose names were erased, whose bodies were given away, whose destruction was so complete that they left almost no trace in the historical record. Tonight you will learn about the punishment the Egyptians called giving to the soldiers. Not execution, which would have been quick, not slavery, which at least provided clear legal status, but something worse than either. A dissolution of personhood so complete that the woman who endured it ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, while her body continued to function, continued to be used, continued to serve purposes that the legal codes described only in euphemisms. You will learn why this punishment was reserved for specific crimes, particularly crimes that embarrassed powerful men or threatened the stability of religious institutions. You will learn about the frontier garrisons where these women were sent, isolated outposts where 300 soldiers lived for years without leave, without families, without access to the women of respectable society. You will learn what happened in those garrisons, not in graphic detail, but in the systematic reality that the sources preserve. You will learn about the women who survived, because some did survive, emerging after years of garrison service into a world that did not know what they had endured, that had no framework for understanding what had been done to them. You will learn what happened to these survivors, how they rebuilt lives from fragments, how some chose silence and some chose testimony, how the stories that survived were almost always filtered through male scribes who had their own reasons for recording or concealing. You will learn why Egyptian sources describe this punishment so rarely, why the legal codes that authorize it use language so vague that scholars have debated for decades what it actually meant. You will learn that the vagueness was deliberate, that the punishment was designed to be unspeakable in the literal sense, something that respectable Egyptians did not speak about directly, because speaking about it would acknowledge realities they preferred to ignore. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness beneath Egypt's golden surface. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Nefertari is 3 days away from Buhan, 3 days away from becoming communal property of 300 soldiers, 3 days away from discovering what given actually means. And I am going to tell you exactly what she experienced. But before I reveal what happened to Nefertari in that garrison, before I explain the system that processed her and the years that changed her, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Egyptian justice functioned, why this punishment existed, and what made it worse than the alternatives that seem more obviously terrible. Because you cannot understand what Nefertari endured without understanding the logic that created her fate. Egyptian justice was not designed to be fair. It was designed to maintain order, protect the powerful, and make examples of those who threatened a stability that allowed civilization to function along the narrow strip of fertile land bordering the Nile. The legal system had developed over nearly 2,000 years by the time Nefertari's sentence was pronounced. It was sophisticated, bureaucratic, documented in records that allow modern scholars to reconstruct its operations in considerable detail. Egyptians believed in Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order and justice, and they believed that their legal system embodied this principle, that the punishments they imposed were not merely practical but cosmically appropriate. This belief allowed them to impose punishments of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining absolute certainty that they were acting righteously. The punishment system was graduated according to the severity of the offense and the status of the offender. Minor crimes might result in beatings, fines, or forced labor. More serious crimes could lead to mutilation, the cutting off of ears, nose, or hands, or to the copper mines, where conditions were so brutal that sentences of more than 2 years were effectively death sentences. The most serious crimes against the state or the gods warranted execution, sometimes by impalement, sometimes by being thrown to the crocodiles, sometimes by being burned alive. But there were also crimes that occupied a peculiar middle ground, crimes that were serious enough to require severe punishment, but that involved circumstances making standard punishments inappropriate. Crimes where the guilty party was a man of some status, but his wife was also implicated, even if only by association. Crimes where making an example required punishment that would be visible and memorable, without requiring the expense and ritual pollution of execution. For these crimes, the punishment of giving was available. The practice appears to have originated in the military context. Frontier garrisons, isolated for years at a time, posed specific problems for military discipline. Soldiers who served at places like Buin or Elephantine were far from their families, far from the women of their communities, far from any acceptable outlet for desires that Egyptian culture normally channeled through marriage and concubinage. Left entirely without sexual